Well, hi there. So in this video, we're going to do 7.2 Equilibrium lecture number 1. So this is where we're going to put aggregate demand and aggregate supply together. And hopefully you can hear me okay. I'm wearing my mask because I've actually got a group of students here in the room with me who are gracious enough to let me do this recording. So what we're really just doing is putting the two lines we already learned about, we're putting them together in one spot. So it shouldn't be too bad. It's the very first thing. So, right, we've got GDPR, which we know is equal to Y, and you can choose either one, and you have price levels up here. Now, the easiest thing to do with equilibrium is start with LRAS. So do this in the order that I'm doing it, and it'll be a little bit easier going forward. We start with LRAS as that vertical line, right? That just tells us what's the full amount of employment, right? The full level of use of our economy. And then we've got aggregate demand. And then we're going to draw, and we got to be careful here. Ooh, that was good. SRAS. And notice that all three lines cross in the middle there. And that's where we're going to say PL star, right? That's the current price level. And we are at, we'd say Y star, if you want to put another marker down there and say that's where we currently are. So when all three lines, when all three the same, then we'd say equilibrium. Right? So this is where kind of the economy will reset to in the long run in the absence of anything else, right? So kind of the economic interaction of short run aggregate supply and aggregate demand is actually what creates the current price level in the economy. So thinking back a while ago, I taught about inflation, and I didn't tell you why we have inflation, but and maybe in a personal lecture, maybe I told you one or two things, but there's really three reasons that you get inflation, right? You've got the quantity of money out there, right? That's the first one. If you have more money typically and everything else is the same, then the price levels will be higher. Then the other two reasons are if aggregate demand changes or if aggregate supply changes, right? If it's more expensive to produce stuff, that's the aggregate supply. So it's the cost of production. Or if there's more demand for goods and services, that's the aggregate demand side. And if either of those move around, then the price level will move around. So that kind of explains inflation right there for you in one little picture. Now we're going to draw 3 or 4 more pictures with this lecture today, and we're going to have different types of gaps. So in the short run, if one of these lines, aggregate supply or aggregate demand, moves, you get a gap. And so let's say the first one, let's say it's going to be caused by aggregate demand moving. And so we'll redraw the graph. And what we're going to do is start with the graph in equilibrium. So we're going to start just like we did before, aggregate demand, and put a dot and say short run aggregate supply YF PL star. And we were going to create something called an expansionary gap. And within that name, right, expansion tells you kind of we're expanding the economy. So we're expanding output, right? Expanding output, or Y, right? The quantity of output. And so how would we get there to be more Y if there's aggregate demand changing? Well, it would be aggregate demand increasing, right? So if aggregate demand increases, then we end up with this kind of short run period where we've got a little bit more output, right? We went from YF to Y1, so we'd say output goes up. But what also happened here to price levels? Well, price levels went up. So if aggregate demand goes up, we'd say price levels go up and output goes up. They both rise. And we have a gap. And the gap, if you're wondering, like, why do we call it a gap? Well, now this is the gap, right? It's the distance of the output. It's called an output gap. It's a fancy way of saying you're not at full employment. Now you can imagine we could have one of these also caused by aggregate supply, right? So if aggregate supply, and so I'm just going to put an increase here as well. And if short run aggregate supply increases. So draw this, output, PL, aggregate demand. And I broke my own rule just right there. I don't know if you saw that. I normally draw the LRAS first, right? It's easier to do that. Ooh, well, that wasn't very straight at all. Oh my goodness. Okay, and we currently are at PL star. And if SRAS goes up, right, there's an increase. Maybe energy costs are now cheaper, right? Short run aggregate supply shifts to the right. So we notice they both shift to the right here. But in this one, you get more output, Y1, so that's a gap. right? Remember, that's the gap between the two. And so output goes up. What happened to prices? This is what's kind of neat. In this one, the price levels fell, right? So kind of compare these two here for a moment. If aggregate demand goes up, you could cause inflation, right? Inflation happened. But if the costs go down in the sense that aggregate supply increases, price levels will go down. So that's kind of nice. Cheaper stuff. This isn't necessarily deflation either, by the way. We don't have units that we're using on the price level axis. The y-axis is sometimes in dollars, right? So this is a dollar denominated axis. But this isn't necessarily deflation. This could be disinflation. Maybe it's bringing the price level down from 15% to 5%, right? So you could think about it as a percent if that helps as well, although there's never really typically units assigned to that. It's a little bit more like an index value, like our consumer price index. Okay, now we're going to work the reverse, recessionary gap, and we'll say this is a recession caused by aggregate demand. So Y, PL, and LRAS, YF, and we're going to start as before in the equilibrium. And by the way, a little trick for you is if you're struggling to get these things to be right where all of them line up at the same spot, you just use a dot and make your dot nice and big. And if it covers all of them, then you're good. That's all you got to do. So you just put a dot on there. Okay, now, if it's a recession, aggregate demand is going to decrease. I got to put my little PL on here. Whew, getting ahead of myself. AD2, decrease. So now, in our short run period, we are here at Y1, right? So there's another gap, but in this case, this gap here is below full employment. That's what we call a recession, right? When our Y1 is less than the full level, that would correspond, right, if we had a PPC, to a point like inside the curve. That's what that kind of means there. Now, if the scenario happens where AD goes down, price level will go down and output will both go down. So that one's not too bad. This type, though, is a really nasty kind of recession. It's so bad, in fact, that we give it a special name. We call it stagflation because it's a stagnant economy plus inflation. Stagnant economy plus inflation. So it's kind of a bad, it's a twofer of bad, right? Really bad. Just awful, stinky, no good. Aggregate demand. Oh, I got that one right on. SRAS dot PL star. Now, if this one, we'd say aggregate supply is going to decrease. Maybe oil prices went up, right? So short run aggregate supply shifted to the left. And now we've got higher prices and less output. Oops, that's a little arrow there. So that's our gap. So prices went up and output went down. This is the worst. The worst. Because when output goes down, we'd say, therefore, unemployment is going to go up. Because remember, right, if we're underneath the curve over here, then we have unemployment. And so both of these down here are unemployment because you have less output than the full. But imagine, right, that you have a scenario where you lose your job and your grocery bill is a little less. Well, it's not the end of the world, right? It's bad. That's bad. Your grocery bill, though, is a little less. So it's a little cheaper maybe to buy groceries. But imagine if you're living in this world over here where you lose your job and now your grocery bill is higher. Oh, my goodness. That's the worst. And so this is what we call stagflation. This happened in the 1970s. And the policy solution, and this skips ahead a little bit as we kind of wrap up this lecture, the policy solution to this one is very difficult. To fix this one is actually not terribly difficult, the solution to fix this type of gap. And likewise, we don't, the solution to an expansionary gap is actually by AD is quite easy to fix. This one is easy if you want to get us back to YF from Y1. This one is actually one where we don't often try to fix it. Because if SRAS increased and it was a permanent increase, then eventually we know that that long run curve will kind of shift to the right as well. And the nice thing then would be is that then we're more output and lower prices. And so people would generally be happy about this one. So this one is the best, right? And so this one's great. This one's rotten. Okay, hopefully that helped you. I'll see you next time.